jumping back into the series we kicked off last week called In the Meantime. And kind of the big focus for this series is that each and every one of us has been through a season before where it felt like life was on pause. Maybe you were praying and praying and praying but hadn't heard an answer yet. Maybe there was a relationship you were trying to reconcile, but it's still just as broken as it was before. Or maybe you've been asking God for vision, direction, guidance for the future, and yet things are still uncertain. And oftentimes when we're in those seasons, it feels like God is silent, we've been abandoned, and we're all alone. But what we said last week is the meantime matters. That even when we're in a season of waiting, God is still working if we are willing to position ourselves to hear from Him and see Him move in our lives. But there are many different things that sometimes in those seasons prevent us from putting our focus on God. This morning, I want to talk about one of those things that, quite honestly, we don't talk a lot about at church or really just in life in general because it's uncomfortable, it's not pleasant. I want to talk about what happens when we experience pain in our lives. I don't know if you're like me, I stub my toe or step on a Lego, which is like the worst feeling in the entire world. And somebody say, what's wrong? I say, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it. We don't want to acknowledge the pain. And yet for many of us, when we refuse to acknowledge the pain, it becomes destructive. But if we are willing to trust God with our pain, it can become instructive in our lives. My wife and I, when we bought our first house, the basement, the previous owners had started finishing off the basement, but hadn't got really far. And so we thought this would be a cool project to do. Now, growing up, my dad gave me this sage advice. He said, son, there are two types of people in the world. There are the people who can afford to pay contractors to do the work, and then there are the people who have to figure out how to do it themselves. We are that second group of people. So I thought, what a great learning opportunity for me. So I learned how to frame in a basement. I learned how to hang drywall. I wasn't good at it, but I did learn how to do it. I was able to pull electrical and add lights. We put in flooring. Kind of the last step of finishing off this basement is we wanted to put some carpet going from the main floor to the downstairs. Now listen, this house was not ever going to be featured on This Old House or any kind of renovation show. So I thought, you know what I'm just going to do? I'll just staple the carpet like kind of in the corner. And then, every stair has a little lip. I'll just staple it under there and it'll look good. So I measured twice, we cut once, everything's going well. I go to the first step and I grab my handy dandy carpet stapler. Now I had never used one of these before, but how hard could it be, right? There's a handle, a trigger, you pull it, staple comes out. So I put the carpet under the lip, I position the stapler, and I pull the trigger, and instead of sending the staple through the carpet into the wood, I sent it straight into the middle of my palm. Because I had it turned backwards, because I did not know what I was doing. And I don't know if you ever have these moments where your brain kind of turns off because it cannot believe how stupid that you just were. And I remember looking down at my hand and I was like, well, there's only one way to fix this, and I just have to pull the staple out. Now that is where pain was very instructive and instructive quickly, because I've never made that mistake ever again. But there are times where the pain takes time. It takes seasons in order to produce the growth and change that's required. It wasn't long after that I decided I wanted to train for a 5K. I know, I'm a physical specimen. What can I say? And so I get one of those Couch to 5K apps. And so you're walking at first, and then you do some walking and running. I start to get to some of these longer runs. And I'm like 2 minutes into an 8-minute run, and my lungs are burning. And my legs are begging me to go back and get a snack and sit on the couch, right? I'm in pain. But what happens over time is that the more of these runs you go on, the capacity of your lungs increases. The stamina of your legs continues to grow. Your body produces endurance. Now, I wish that happened after one training race, right? But it's actually days, weeks, months of stretching and preparing your body through the pain in order to see the kind of change that we want to see. By the way, I won first place in my age division. There were only 2 of us, but I still got first place in my age division. The reality is this is what happens in our lives. We will go through these series of pain, and if we're willing to trust God with our pain, He's willing to use it to shape us, to change us, to grow us. But I think for a lot of us, part of the reason we're a little afraid or ashamed to trust God with our pain is that oftentimes the pain is a result of our own choices. You ever heard that phrase? Well, isn't it the consequences of my own actions? Like maybe you find yourself drowning in tens of thousands of dollars of credit card debt because you have been unwise financially. And instead of being honest with God and learning how to be a better steward, the solution is just take out more loans, transfer the balance to a new card. Or maybe for you, it's that you were afraid of conflict, so you avoided honest conversations with your spouse for years, and now you're so far down the road that there's this tension and discouragement in your relationship, and it's easier for you to ignore it by focusing on something else than trusting God to work through the pain to bring healing and restoration. My hope for us today is that we would learn in these seasons what it looks like to allow God to take our pain and make it instructive. Now, the good news for us is we're not the only people who've ever had to wade through these seasons of pain. In fact, we're going to be in the same place we've been since the beginning of the year, right at the turn of the century from the 600 BCs into the 500 BCs. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to look at a different book today. It's Lamentations chapter 3. If you have your Bibles, open up to Lamentations chapter 3. Now, as you're turning there, let me kind of remind us where we are in history. In 605 BC, the Jewish people have been conquered by the Babylonian Empire. About 8 years later, they come in, they lay siege to the city of Jerusalem and start shipping Jewish people off to other parts. Then, 10 years after that, the Babylonians come in, fully destroy the temple, and move all the Jewish people somewhere else. So by the time you get to about 586, 587 BC, the Jewish people are feeling discouraged. Talk about being in a season of pain. You've been conquered. Maybe some of your relatives have been slaughtered. You've been moved to a foreign land. You are now a subjugated people. And to make matters worse, the temple was destroyed, and that was God's home. They don't only feel like they've been conquered, they feel like they've been abandoned by God, which is hard for them to wrap their minds around because the Jewish people for centuries had been told the story of how God entered a covenant relationship with their forefather, Abraham. Now, we talk about covenants sometimes at church, but we live in a culture that really prioritizes contracts over covenants. Here's the big difference. A contract has a start and end dates and certain stipulations so that contract reaches its conclusion. Like, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's looking forward to the day where my relationship with the bank holding my mortgage gets to end because the contract is completed. But a covenant is this ultimate till death do us part agreement that we enter into. In Genesis chapter 12, God enters into a covenant with Abraham and all his descendants. Now, if a covenant's till death do us part and God enters into it, when is this covenant over? It's never going to be over. And so the Old Testament just details story after story of God's faithfulness to his covenant people. When they find themselves enslaved in Egypt, God sends Moses to rescue them, deliver them to freedom. When David is ruling and reigning on the throne, he promises that a descendant of David will always be on the throne. He is faithful to his people, but now it's hard to feel like God's being faithful to them because there is no descendant of David on the throne. The temple is gone, and they're left wondering, is God finished with us? And to make matters worse, it wasn't like they hadn't been warned. Like the prophet Jeremiah spent decades telling them, hey, stop your idolatry. Stop being self-absorbed. Turn back and be faithful to God, because if you don't, his justice is coming. And so they, like many of us, sit there and they're wondering, am I just reaping the consequences of my own actions? Now, Lamentations is an interesting book. We're not told within the book who wrote it, although tradition tells us that Jeremiah is the author of this. But Lamentations is never going to be one of those books that like people wake up in the morning and you get your coffee and sit down, you want to read through it and then post an inspirational quote. Because Lamentations is a depressing read. It's 5 chapters long, but each chapter is a poem. Now, what's interesting is poems number 1 through 4, they're an acrostic poem. So if you remember these from elementary school, so the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the first line. The second letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the second line, and so forth. So the first, second, and fourth all have 22 verses because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew language. Now, the fifth one is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a second. The first poem in Lamentations 1 is all about describing Israel as this widow in public grief. It's this idea that we have been publicly shamed. Like, how many of us know it's one thing to experience failure internally, it's another thing when it's visible for everyone to see. It's another thing when that divorce becomes official on Facebook and now everyone knows the marriage didn't work. Or when you have to close the business and people understand that your dreams did not come to fruition. It's always painful to experience shame. It's another thing when it's public. And so the first one is all about our public shame. The second poem, Lamentations chapter 2, is all about how God is a judge who has unleashed his wrath on his people. Now, I always like to make this important note. When I think of wrath, I tend to think of like this impulsive, violent action. But that's not the way the Bible talks about God's wrath. The way the Bible describes it is God's wrath is his justice. It's his judgment. Oftentimes it's just this handing over to your own desires. Oh, you don't want to be in a relationship with me? You don't want to honor me? That's fine. Here's what happens when you don't. You want to be selfish, self-absorbed? Here's what happens in your relationships when that's how you are. He's handing them over through his justice. Lamentations chapter 4 details how things used to be and how they are now. They used to be good, and now they're awful. We used to have kids who are laughing and playing in the streets, and now the streets are desolate. There used to be people with lots of money eating good food, and now they're just beggars reaching for crumbs. And then chapter 5 is one that is different. See, the author of Lamentations shows us this acrostic pattern. It's an ordered poem in a disordered world. It underscores kind of the chaos all around them. The fifth verse is just the fifth lamentation is just very chaotic. And do you know how it ends? It's like God could save us, but I don't even know if he wants to. Again, not your morning inspirational Instagram post. Now, the one we didn't talk about is the one we're looking at today, and that's Lamentations 3. This one is slightly different. It is an acrostic, but instead of each verse starting with the same letter, each letter has 3 verses with it. So it's 3 times as long. Instead of 22 verses to match the 22 Hebrew letters, it's 66 verses because it's the 22 letters times 3. And this is the one lamentation section where they actually examine that this pain that we are in may not actually be the end of the story. And it's put here right in the middle because I think in the midst of all the grief and the pain, the author is inviting God in to bring about change and to reveal some truth. So that's where we're going to jump in this morning. Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 19. It says, "Remember my affliction and my homelessness, the wormwood and the poison. I continually remember them and have become depressed. Yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope." Let's pause here for a moment. He says, remember my affliction and homelessness. Actually, the way this would read in Hebrews is, I remember my affliction, my homelessness, my wormwood and poison. I looked up what wormwood was because it sounds more like a Harry Potter than a biblical character than a biblical word. Wormwood is actually, the Hebrew describes the bitter herbs that the Jewish people would use in various feasts. Much like in the Passover meal, there were bitter herbs that as the Jewish people ate it, it would remind them of the bitterness of their slavery in Egypt. Furthermore, it would remind them of ultimately the bitterness of their slavery to sin. So this author here is saying, hey, I know my affliction. I know that we have been taken from our home. I know what it's like to experience the bitter effects of slavery to sin. It feels like a poison that is destroying my life. He goes on to say, I am depressed. The Hebrew word for depressed literally means my soul is being pushed down. It's this weight of heaviness of the circumstances that feels like it's going to crush him. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before. But what I love about the author of Lamentations here is he's not mincing words, is he? He's being open and honest about the pain that he's experiencing. And listen, I think before any kind of healing can occur, before any kind of lesson can happen, we have to be willing to be open and honest about what it is that we are going through. Open and honest with ourselves, but also open and honest with God. I've talked to you guys before. I spent about 1.5 years in counseling, and I am a person who I think I feel emotions, but I don't know what emotions are. So my counselor literally one time said, have you seen the movie Inside Out? My job is to help you figure out which one of those emotions is at the control board right now. So she pulls out this thing called the feelings wheel. And so at the middle, there's like your kind of 5 core feelings: happy, sad, angry, all that stuff. But the further out you go on the wheel, there's more descriptive words. And I wonder if some of us, the reason that we get stuck here in our pain is because we're not even able to take time to discern, what is it that I'm feeling? Maybe it's not just that you're angry, it's that you're disappointed that you felt like God didn't deliver a promise that he gave you. Maybe you're not just scared, but you're actually fearful that you're going to live your entire life in isolation and alone. Maybe you're defensive because you feel like other people are on the attack. Listen, can I be honest with you? If you can't be honest with God about what you're feeling, there's not going to be that change that happens in your life. God is big enough. He is not scared of your doubts, your questions. We can be open and honest with him. And it's after the author is open and honest about their afflictions and pain and depression that then he says, but now I see something that gives me hope. The hope comes after we name where we are. But what is it that the author sees that brings them hope? Look at the very next verse, verse 22. Because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will put my hope in him. What is it that in the midst of the affliction, the pain, the bitterness, the depression, that offers hope? He says it's the Lord's faithful love. The Hebrew word for faithful love there is actually the word hesed, which Bible translators will say it is one of the most difficult words to translate from Hebrew into English. Not because we don't know what hesed means, but because the concept is so loaded, it's hard to translate it in just a couple words. What it really refers to is that covenant faithfulness that God has. That God is faithful to his people even when they are not faithful to him. That he keeps his promises even when sometimes it looks like he's forgotten them. This is what hesed is. Furthermore, the Jewish people in their faith, they practice hesed when they actually do works of charity. When they care for the poor, the orphan, the widow, they go visit people in prison. This is their hesed, because faithful love looks like serving people who can't give anything in return. It's a self-sacrifice that prioritizes the other person, even if it costs you something, because that's how God loves us. And he says, listen, I see the affliction, I see everything wrong, but you know what else I see? I see his faithful love because he reminds me that there are new mercies every single day. Last summer, I went on sabbatical. And as I started sabbatical, I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to accomplish, right? Like, I'm very task-oriented. If we're going to take a break, we better accomplish some things while we're on the break. And so I remember the first week, I go to my aunt has a house on a lake in Alabama. I remember the first morning, I'm sitting there with my coffee, and there's this fog that settles in over the lake, and I was like, that is how I feel right here. Like, I have no idea what to expect. There's a fogginess in front of me. But then the light began to break through, and I was like, that's what I'm hoping for, this sabbatical, is that God would bring some clarity here. And so as part of this gaining clarity, I was supposed to journal. And again, because I don't recognize my feelings, I don't know what you're supposed to journal, right? Like, to me, a to-do list or a grocery list is journaling. I don't think that's how you're supposed to do it. That's how I typically do it. So my counselor gave me 2 different activities to do, and really one of them resonated with me so much I ended up doing it every single day. And here's how simple it is. I was supposed to sit down and list out 20 things I was grateful for. And there were a couple caveats. Number 1, I cannot use the same list that I used the day before, and I can't list my kids individually just to get to 20 closer, right? So it's like wife can be 1, kids can be 1, and some of you have 28 pets, so I know you would just list your pets out there. But no, the whole reason, though, is once you start to do this, you're like 20, that's not that many. But you get to 8, 9, and 10, and you start to run out of steam. You're like, I'm only halfway there. And that's the first day. Now try after a week where you're not repeating things. Why do we do that? Because all of a sudden you start to train your brain to stop looking at the problems and start looking at God's blessings. What are the things that I should be grateful for? I'm seeing his mercies in new places all the time. Listen, we want to name where we're at and be honest, but we name it so we don't get stuck there. That might be where we start, but we want to continue to focus on God and his mercies, which are new every single day. I love that last phrase in this section of verses. It says, the Lord is my portion. which I always thought was like just poetic language, but that's not at all what's happening here. Remember, this is a Jewish author, and in the Jewish faith, the people received a portion of an inheritance of land that was given to the different tribes. So if you were part of the tribe of Benjamin, you had an inheritance of land over here. If you were part of the tribe of Judah, you had this inheritance. They called it, that's my portion. In fact, in the Old Testament, there is a prescription for something called the year of Jubilee. So every 49th or 50th year, all slaves would be set free, all debt would be forgiven, and all land would go back to its original owners. This was a protection for descendants of people who maybe got in financial trouble and had to sell their land to somebody else. God would honor them by giving them their portion back. But now the Jewish people have been conquered. They've been shipped to a different part of the empire. They don't have a portion anymore. The thing that they used to count on, the thing they used to believe in, their rock, their anchor was gone. But now, the author of Lamentations, see, actually the Lord is my portion. It was never in this other thing I put my hope in. It was actually in God. It wasn't in the gift. It was always in the giver. And I wonder if sometimes in our life, the pain we experience is actually the pain that God allows when something is removed that took the place of him in our lives. I was listening to a podcast recently. They were just talking about how the human brain is wired. And we are wired to be social creatures. Like if you think about a lot of the stuff you're fearful of is something that might make you stand out from everybody else for good or bad reasons. And they actually cited this study that was done where they took people who were in long-term romantic relationships, so relationships for over a year. And they found people who had just broken up out of a long-term relationship. They took them and put them in an fMRI machine, a functional MRI, where they can scan brain waves in real time. And so they took these people, and what they noted is that in every single person, even the ones who initiated the breakup, when they asked them to think about their ex, they had the exact same brain waves and chemistry as someone who was a cocaine addict. Because this is how we attach to people that strongly in our lives. I wonder if sometimes the pain we feel is because God may bring a relationship to an end because you had been looking to that person for love, acceptance, and intimacy rather than looking towards him. I wonder if there are times in our life where God allows us to be laid off, to lose our job because we had put all our hope and all our identity for success and career advancement in a job rather than finding our identity in him. I wonder if God allows us sometimes to lose the gift so we remember that the giver is our portion and the one we put our hope and trust in. That's what pain will allow us to start to see. He continues in the next verse. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is still young. It says it's good for those who want to wait on the Lord. Now remember, this is not just, hey, I'm just waiting for the go-ahead to do. No, this is waiting in a season of pain, in a season of they're dealing with the consequences of their own actions. It's a season of discipline. That phrase, to bear the yoke, that was how ancient rabbis would refer to discipline. And it says that it is a good thing for a young man to go through a season of discipline. As a father who is raising 3 young men, I don't know that any of them have ever thought it was good to go through a season of discipline. But we know that in order to shape character, that's what is required. Remember, I grew up in a house. This is not a statement on spanking, but when I was a kid, spanking was used in our house. And I don't know if you ever experienced that. Sometimes your parents might say something like, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. And I remember as a kid thinking, well, then if you really want to punish me, let's just switch spots here, But no kid wants to go through any kind of punishment. Now, the reality is that with 3 boys of my own, it doesn't matter what kind of punishment you give. In the moment, nobody wants consequences for their action. You take a toy away from a toddler because they hit somebody else. Oh, you hate me and you don't want this. You tell a teenager that they don't have access to their phone or their car. It's, oh, you just don't want me to have any freedom or any fun. No. It's that I care about your character more than your comfort. And so I don't, despite what my kids think, I don't stay up all night dreaming up ways to make their life miserable. It wouldn't take me that long to come up with ways. I want them to grow, to be the strong, godly men that he's created them to be. And so sometimes that requires being willing to sit under discipline. It is hard to do because our natural reaction is to push back against that. So what is the attitude we should have when it comes to discipline? He continues in verse 28. Let him sit alone and be silent, for God has disciplined him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. Perhaps there is still hope. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. Let him be filled with disgrace. To me, this is meaningful. He says, when this young person is experiencing discipline, let him sit alone and be silent. What he's not saying is, let me just put you all by yourself and make you miserable. I think what the author's communicating here is most of the time when we're under discipline, we want to argue. We want to push back. I think like for my kids, when they hear the word no, they think if I just ask the question 1,000 more times in different ways, maybe I can get the answer I want. I think when it comes to any time that we're under discipline from God or somebody else, we want to push back against this. We talked before so many times over the years about this idea. I think our natural inclination is to BCD, blame, complain, defend. When we find ourselves in these seasons of pain, we want to blame somebody else. I want to blame, well, it's my boss and you don't understand. He was just unreasonable. And listen, if that's your story for the last 5 bosses you have, perhaps the problem isn't your boss. Perhaps the problem it's you. Because when we're always blaming other people, we never receive what we're supposed to receive. We complain about our circumstances. Well, you don't know, like this is how I grew up and this is what I dealt with. Listen, I am very aware that people do not grow up in the same circumstances because my kids have grown up in a very different life than I had when I grew up. And that's by design, right? We want our kids to have a good life. So I understand we all start from a different place, but our circumstances can't be an excuse not to make progress. Otherwise, we become victims of our circumstances and we can't make progress. How about this? We want to defend ourselves. This is a hard one for me because it's hard for me to admit when I've done something wrong. And so I want to defend myself by saying, well, my intentions were good, even if my actions were not. You ever heard that phrase? We judge other people by their actions. We judge ourselves by our intentions. And so we're constantly defending ourselves. This is how defending can get you stuck. My first year as a pastor, one of the blessings of having podcasts and YouTube stuff is like people can follow along when they've missed church. One of the downsides is like people from all over the world can tune in. I mean, there could be, we have people who tune in from places in Asia. High hopes somebody is in Mexico in a swimming pool watching today. That would be pretty cool. But somebody picked up this teaching that I did and put me on a podcast where they just played the teaching and went through and said, here's all the things he did wrong or he said bad or that we don't agree with. And I like, who am I? It was like on the same episode, it's me, Andy Stanley, and Beth Moore. I'm like, who am I to be? I mean, at least good company, but seriously, like, why are you picking on me? But what ended up happening, I never actually went and listened to it, but I know people who did. And so what happened is I spent so much of my sermon prep time figuring out how can I nuance everything to preemptively defend myself from what somebody else may say. It actually prevented me from actually doing what God had called me to do. Sometimes even just defending ourselves, even from saying, hey, we didn't do anything wrong, can actually prevent us from moving forward. Are we willing to sit silently, not feel like we have to make excuses for ourselves, and just trust that God is working in the midst of our pain? The last group of verses I want to read here. This is so important. This is why we have to read these ones. It says, "For the Lord will not reject us forever. Even if he causes suffering, he will show compassion according to the abundance of his faithful love. For he does not enjoy bringing affliction or suffering on mankind." God allows discipline for a season. There are moments where he allows pain, but it's not because he wants you to suffer. He is a compassionate God, a loving God who wastes nothing. Right? There are times in our life where we experience pain because we've made poor decisions. There are times in this life where we experience pain because we live in a broken world. And I just think we have to be very careful about attributing things in the world to the secret will of God. Because here's what I know, God is so good at taking things that were meant for evil and turning them for good that sometimes we can't tell if it was part of his plan all along or not. But here's the comfort that means. It means no matter what you're going through, number one, it's not going to be the end. God is still working through that. Number two, he's not going to waste anything. Your mess eventually becomes your ministry. The thing that was maybe the lowest point in your life, God will use that not only to bring you through, but so you can minister to somebody else. It's a message of hope. Because hope doesn't say this is going to be done tomorrow. Hope is not saying this season of waiting will end by the end of the week. Hope is saying, I know that God is working through this even in my waiting. You know, I think about Jesus and his own experience with pain. It's one of the reasons that I'm so captivated with him, because in Jesus we serve a God who is not distant and unfamiliar with the struggles of the human existence. Jesus himself experienced pain. The pain of being misunderstood, called a heretic and a blasphemer. The pain of losing a loved one to the point that Jesus even wept. The pain of having a close friend betray him for pieces of silver. Jesus would ultimately experience the pain of the cross. But in Matthew 26, we get the story of Jesus being in what is oftentimes called the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane is not necessarily an actual place. The word actually means an oil press. And if I was a better pastor, I would have had a picture of an oil press for you this morning. But the way oil presses were, they were these buildings built in the middle of a garden full of olive trees. And so they would harvest the olives, they would bring them into this big stone bowl, and they would set them there. And then they had this boulder that would roll over it, and it would crush and squeeze all of the oil out of the olives that would drip down. It was a place of crushing and pressing to get the good stuff out. So when Jesus goes into this garden right before he's about to be arrested and crushed, I think it says he knows what's about to happen. In fact, Jesus goes into this garden and he says, listen, I am so deeply moved. I am depressed to the point of wanting to die. I see echoes of Lamentations 3 in his statement there. And then he says, God, if there's any way, could you please let this cup pass from me? It's actually a reference to Jeremiah 25, where God says his cup of wrath, his cup of justice will be poured out on everyone, starting with God's people. That was their period of exile. Then on to their oppressors, the ones who actually conquered them and moved them away. God's justice will come on everyone. But now Jesus knows he's about to drink this cup of wrath. But here's the difference. Jesus wasn't drinking it because he deserved it. He was drinking it on behalf of you and me. And so even as he's there, he's begging if there's any other way. Jesus was willing to endure the pain. Why? What could be worth it? In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it says, let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It said, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It is very hard for me. If my conception of joy is happiness and excitement and a smile on my face, how is Jesus experiencing joy in this moment? See, I think Jesus had a different understanding of joy. He was willing to endure the pain of the cross because he knew what was on the other side. And through the resurrection, what was on the other side was a relationship with you and with me. He was willing to endure the pain so that you could have a relationship with God. And if Jesus, even in his story, pain and suffering wasn't the end, then for those of us who follow Jesus, that's not the end of our story either. If we're willing to allow him, God will take this pain that otherwise would have been destructive and make it instructive. How do we do that? A couple quick thoughts here for you. The first is just name it honestly. Maybe you're here today and you're wrestling through a season of pain. Just be honest with God about it. Just be honest. He's not afraid. He can handle it. We don't have to sugarcoat it. We don't have to say, well, I'm too blessed to be stressed. Sometimes you can just tell God how stressed you are. Sometimes you can tell him the pain that you're going through, but just be honest about it. Second, allow God to use it. This one's a lot harder. Naming it is one thing. Being open and allowing God to use it, that might mean sitting in silence. Stop the blame, complain, defend. Just recognizing that maybe if God removed something, it's because he wants you to remember that he's your portion. Will you allow him to use it? And the last thing is let hope turn to joy. See, that's so important. Hope says God isn't going to waste this. And the joy comes because we know that he will redeem everything in this life. I have one more thought for us, but before we do, I want to leave a little time for Q&A. Just remember our guidelines for questions. Questions, not comments, relatively quick and to the point and relevant to what we're talking about today. So if anybody has a question, you want to raise your hand, now would be a great time to do that. Going once, going twice. All right, here's what I want us to do. We're going to continue this morning like we do every week with a time of communion. So we have our communion stations around the room. On one half, we have the communion elements, the crackers and juice, the body and blood of Jesus. On the other half, we have our prayer elements. You can write a prayer to God. Maybe it's just naming, here's the pain that I'm feeling right now. I'm putting that in the prayer jar. Or lighting a candle, because throughout church history, that's represented offering a prayer. But there is one other element on those tables today, and I want to draw your attention to it. It's these little cards here that say pray for one. So we're 1 month out from Easter today. And so my challenge for us in the rest of this Lent season is, would we pick one person to pray for once a day for 1 month? Because here's my hope. My hope is that you're here today, and today's message is preparatory, meaning you are not in a season of pain. That's my hope for you. But maybe God's given you this message today because that's something you need to pass on to somebody else. Maybe you know somebody who's fighting a battle, who's going through a struggle, who feels like God has abandoned them, left them, hung them out to dry. Maybe that's a person you can just begin to pray for. So listen, this is not an invite. Do not hand this to them. This is just, there's a space for you to write their name, and there's 4 little prayer prompts right here. Just, would you be willing to pray for one person? That's one way that we can actually exemplify the joy of saying, hey, I've been through these seasons before. I know maybe you're like, you know what it's like to lose a loved one. You know what it's like to deal with aging parents. You know what it's like to feel like you're swimming up to your eyeballs in debt. You know what it's like to battle an addiction, a struggle. And now that you've gone through the valley, can you be the example of a life full of joy, that God took your pain and redeemed it, and through that can bring hope to someone else? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're just thankful. We're thankful that you were willing to endure the cross for the joy that was before you. And so I pray right now that that would be a verse that those of us who are in the midst of a season of pain could just cling to that right now. To know that the punishment is not the end of the story. The pain that we're wrestling with isn't the final word. I pray you would bring comfort. You would help us to be honest enough to name what we're struggling with. I pray that you would help us to cling to you as our portion, as our hope. And that Jesus, as you're working through the meantime, that you would continue to shape us and change us to be more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.